Hey, it's the Fatboy Show on RX Radio, and the situation in Niger still seems tenuous. I'd like to welcome to the show today our special guest, Mr. Wotsomu Wanda. Welcome to the show, Wotsomu. I often invite you here to discuss economic issues, but I felt like even on the issue of Niger, you might have a thing or two you could share with us. Welcome to the Fatboy Show.
Very happy to be here again.
But of course, we shall still later on talk about the situation with the World Bank and how they have announced they're cutting their loans to Uganda. That's coming up ahead. But first, on the situation in Niger, much has been said about the unfolding chaos in Niger. Over the last 3 years, there have been a number of coups that have taken place in the Sahel region of West Africa, Mali, Burkina Faso, and now finally Niger. And obviously, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, the member nations and their leaders have all expressed this, basically, they've all condemned these coups, understandably so. Ostensibly, they were all democratically elected themselves, and so they would not want to validate the idea of a military coup. Military coups, for example, and an immediate expulsion from the African Union. And so it's something that our leaders don't take lightly. But things have come to a head. ECOWAS have warned Niger to the junta to reinstate the deposed former president. And failing to do so, they might invade and forcefully reinstate. Now, the deadline for this was supposed to have happened over a week ago. The deadline was not met. They met a few days later to discuss, and the military option is still on the table. Where do you think things stand now? There's a lot of gray area. What do you think is happening?
Thank you, Fatboy, again. One thing about Niger is that it's one of those countries that lies at the periphery of what was powerful West African countries. Mm-hmm. During the colonial period, everyone tried to grab some real estate.
Everyone or France?
France and the UK. Okay, European powers for that.
Okay.
Matter. Yeah, their grabbing of real estate was around the coast. So they kept dividing up one country or another, chopping them up and taking possession. Mm-hmm. After which, they are then left with the next expanse of the Sahel or the desert. Mm-hmm. That seemed uninviting or unreachable. Mm-hmm. And France, which is basically far more adventurous, mm-hmm. basically took off almost all the rest of what was left.
Right.
So you find that where there were rivers and lakes and water bodies that would allow either travel, transportation, movement, and dense concentration of populations, where UK and France also took some of them. But then what was left out was Sahel, and you're going to deal with a desert area and that expanse. Those particular areas, and of course you have Niger, you have Chad, you have many of those in those areas are basically very poor countries. And if you see the rankings, normal GDP rankings, they are among the poorest in the world. Some of this could be attributed to colonialism, but basically they're uninviting spaces.
But I mean, if half
else.
your country's desert, obviously it doesn't lend itself to very strong economic prospects. But more on that later, because there is a very important exception in the case of Niger. But also that area, the Sahel region, is mostly populated by nomadic tribes, Berbers and Tuaregs.
Yes.
And I've seen it argued that much of the instability we've been seeing in the region is actually more ethnic based. It is the Tuareg communities, the Arab Tuareg Berber communities, who are feeling marginalized in these predominantly, what can I say, Negro, Bantu, or sort of black populations.
Yes, yes.
And so what ends up happening is that there's a lot of distrust. Different regions of the country believe that they're being overlooked. We saw the same thing in Sudan.
Yes.
Anyway, so it gets to a point where they decide to unite under the banner of religion.
Yes.
Because if you're a Tuareg in Mali and there's a Tuareg in in Burkina
Niger.
Faso and in Niger, you can at least say, well, you know what, we are Muslims, why are we suffering? So we will fight under the banner of Islam, which is why we've been hearing the word jihadist being used by all these junta guys.
Yes.
So when you hear these guys talking about Islamic terrorism or jihad, essentially they're talking about these Berber Tuareg militias who are operating under the banner of Islam to launch what is essentially an ethnic war. Isn't it?
Yes, that's very true. And I think it's where you have to appreciate the aspect of these borders that were demarcated around that period of time. They are cutting up many of these ethnic groups.
And so they are divided among different countries.
That's the first thing, and that's always a problem. But more than anything, they're itinerant. It's not like they are more or less focused in one area. Because when water runs out in some areas, they often move to where there are greener pastures, and then they move back when it kind of rains in the areas. So they're always itinerant, moving, and those movements often are across borders. Now, as we try to form modern African states, we're trying to lock them up in particular areas, and they become foreigners in their normal geographical areas of movement. So if you're turning these particular groups of people into foreigners in their home, their historical lands, it becomes a little bit challenging because the culture wouldn't appreciate what is going on. They wouldn't even know what that entails. As we've tried to form modern states, one thing we've failed to manage are these particular populations that interact from one group or another. They become more or less the central security issue.
I think if you were to ask me, that has been Africa's major problem. We are the most ethnically diverse continent in the world. You know, we look at Japanese and we say, oh, they are very stable because they are civilized. Well, they are one culture.
They are monoculture.
You know, or China to some extent. Korea. And I know you can point to exceptions here and there, but by and large, countries tend to thrive better. There's more unity and stability when it's a monoculture, if it's homogeneous.
Yes, that's true.
And we saw a lot of violence erupting in the former Yugoslavia for the very same reason. You had all these different Serbs, Croats, Muslims, all under one country called Yugoslavia. They couldn't get along. They had to split the country up. And since then, there's been, people have been, at least there's not been, major problems. If you look at the violence in Ukraine right now, the reason Russia claims it invaded Ukraine is, partially to protect the safety of people they're referring to as the Russians in the Donbass region. So once you have a situation in which you have different ethnic communities in other countries and are citizens of that country, whereas they may have brethren in neighboring countries or in a mother country, you immediately create room for tension.
That's true.
And struggle for independence. I do hear that there had been discussions about an independent Sahel region, but it was squashed. Could that have contributed to this?
Exactly. Now, if we form blocks that would at least capture these populations in one unit, even if there were wider expanses of units, where you could have all these, but they would all be in one unit, that would be a little bit more helpful. But then what you have is that the French instituted such a harsh system of colonialism that these particular populations kind of suffered. And those differences that you've clearly indicated then are exacerbated with poverty. And with states that are wide, because these are huge states with very narrow populations.
Now, in the case of Niger, as it turns out, people are talking about the uranium reserves. The uranium deposits are situated in that part of the country occupied by those Tuaregs. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of poverty, but more so in those communities, either through culture or lifestyle because they're nomadic or for whatever other reason. But it so happens they're the poorest in the region and in that country, and yet they are seated on vast uranium deposits. So it is not difficult to see how they might feel like they need to be involved more in the politics of the country, perhaps even militarily, to stake a claim for what they may feel they are owed. And so obviously there is no way that the wider majority, black majority, are going to want to relinquish such a juicy part of the country.
That's very true.
So there will always be that tension.
Yes. Now, within that tension, I think given the poverty, given the wide expanse of the country and the local few populated areas, the rest of the country is basically an empty expanse. You would think of it as empty, but it's an expanse. And so building state institutions that are more functional, infrastructure, roads and the rest of it is a little bit more challenging. And so France was able to hold it down as a country and in control by putting these bases in place and then focusing on what it really is interested in, which is that uranium. Lately, what has exacerbated issues was with the removal of, with Gaddafi in power, he got a mercenary group of fighters from these particular regions. And these were part of his security establishment.
Right.
With the collapse of the Libyan state, of course,
they became free agents.
They are free agents and they came floating in.
They went back to their homes.
Yes.
Had nothing to do.
And they generated what we've seen as an insecurity and what they've called jihadists and a combination of all that. They are very well armed.
So they went back to their homes.
Very well trained.
And they were like, you guys, you're here. Why are we broke? Why are we suffering?
And they could easily march into capitals. They had the capacity to do that, and you saw that across the board.
Yes.
Now, of course, France comes back to kind of put back,
suppress those.
Yeah, so should we say putting the genie back into the bottle, which has basically kind of failed. But as they do that, they then get other troops committed, because France itself has bases in these areas. Now, German comes in and it has also put troops. I think it has like 1,500 troops. They are basically seen as peacekeepers, and they're in Niger itself. America itself has over 1,000 troops in the area, and they're all concentrated in these areas to hold the place. Trying to hold things in place, because coups were all proliferating, and many of these who came up armed, they're well trained, and that confrontation was going on. So there are a lot of drone bases and soldiers within those areas of NATO countries. Of course, what has happened with Ukraine and Russia? Russia, I think, decides, well, this is a place we can play the games. If I'm getting pressure on my border with Ukraine, we can play this game, and the vast area of its play was in Africa, and it's in these areas. You find that all these coups have happened where there are Wanda troops. They are developing the Wanda group.
What came first? My understanding is the coups are staged, and then the junta or militia requests support.
No, I think in Mali and either Chad or one of those countries, these guys were in place, and then the power has been captured, but they're all moving.
Mostly they're hired by the governments in power, not so.
That they came in as mercenaries. Basically, they're mercenaries in area now, and somehow it has generated that instability. That on top of the jihadists, what is in government has the Wanda groups as well, and now there's a mix where you have all these Russian Wanda group of and they kind of are starting facing up with NATO forces that are within the area.
But the French have left, no?
No, in Niger there is the base is still in place.
They're still there.
In place, but they are in lockdown. They're within their base, and the base is within the next to, I think, the state.
And
house
you said the US have...
The US has a base. It has soldiers, over 1,000, I think, are in the area.
My gosh.
And they have a number of drone bases within the area.
So, if...
then, I think what has also added an aspect that is interesting is that recently, after Russia, first of all, over the last 20 years, developed a huge system of supplying gas to Europe, that the infrastructure was overwhelming, and they were able to capture Europe in their hold with gas
hostages.
supplies.
They made Europe hostages.
Yeah, but it was
energy
cheap.
hostages.
Yes. Now, over this last year or last 2 years, the Europe has, especially with the US at leading the process, has been breaking off any connection to Russian gas. They've been when the sanctions came in, the one area that was left out was gas and oil for some period of time. They asked for time
until they blew up the
Nord Stream was blown up specifically to make sure Russia is cut off from supplying Europe with gas. Now, one of the pipelines that is coming up is from Nigeria through Niger and goes to Europe.
Oh.
That would supply gas.
Okay.
Going forward.
All right.
For Russia to interfere with this process becomes strategically important.
Wait a minute. I didn't see that coming.
Yes. And
wait a minute.
And so for Nigeria, especially at the forefront of ECOWAS, this is such a prime opportunity to utilize gas it has been fracking off all the time of Nigerian oil production. Their gas has always been wasted, burnt off, without utilization. It had no market, it had no process in place.
So now Europe then becomes a huge market
finally
for their gas
that Nigeria has wasted for the 30 years it has been producing.
And so it would be in their best interest for there to not be any instability in the region. They would definitely want the Niger president to still be there.
Now you can appreciate where Nigeria is coming from.
So it is more than a principled objection to a coup. This is like, we need our guy there.
But at the same time, appreciate Nigeria was such a coup inflicted area.
Of course, every year there was a coup.
Somehow President Obasanjo had an arrangement where the North-South interchange in the presidency has allowed that stability, and the army has stayed away up to today.
Okay.
You cannot guarantee that the idea will not creep into, especially if this becomes a norm. So Nigeria would be a little bit double careful about coups and instability in the area, first of all for its pipeline and its particular history.
So then, when you look at the different plays being discussed here, the different moves, we're seeing obviously ECOWAS they're still threatening to get into Niger. And if that has potential to cause them to clash with the Wagner group and Niger junta people, and if by happenstance even the French and the Americans get involved, I mean, Niger could turn it could turn into the launching pad for a world war, the launching stage for a world war.
Now that's the danger, because already on the other side some very serious countries are saying no, not in our region. Algeria being one of them. Algeria suffered through a great deal of jihadists. It took a long time for them to stamp on the issue and stop it. I think you remember after they closed down an election of jihadi, of Muslim group, they really suffered, and a long period of terrorism, you'd call it that.
Jeez.
That for them, an explosion within the region is a kind of a threat to their stability, because finally they're stabilized and they have an extremely strong army within the area. So whatever is being discussed, I think a lot of forces are coming into play. There is a lot of aligning on either side. But should this explode, it could be one of the most significant explosions. Out of all the turmoil we've been discussing on many other fronts, this is not something we would want to go down.
And yet it seems inevitable.
It more or less, because when you look at individual sides, jingoism and decision making, and especially the interests, they are quite vital. Europe needs oil or gas outside Russia. Nigeria needs this particular opportunity to supply Europe with gas on a more stable basis for the rest of whatever you think.
Well, then I guess the solution is simple. I appeal to my friends in America to please, in 2024, vote for President Donald Trump. Somehow I feel like this situation calls for a madman.
Yes, that's particularly interesting.
Don't you agree?
Yes, because one thing you have to appreciate about the US, whatever you think of Trump's policies and Biden for that matter, they always follow their national interests. Ultimately, whichever way they align, they will go with a bit of nuance here and everything. But what Biden has implemented was basically continuing what Trump was doing.
It's a continuation of basic U.S. foreign policy. And Trump, famously or unfamously, was always at loggerheads, or at least appeared to be, with the aspirations of many of the military industrial complex people, or the Washington foreign policy people. And like I said, this is what it appeared to be. He could have just been paying lip service to people's sentiments about these issues.
Yes.
But when I look at his term, I feel like some of the moves he made were quite interesting. And in his tenure, we didn't see too much of an eruption of chaos as we have seen because think of it, Ukraine invasion under Biden, Niger crisis brewing under Biden, and he just doesn't seem to me like he's a man who has his finger on the pulse of the situation and can make the necessary diplomatic moves to avert the crisis from escalating further. So that's what I'm counting on. Trump coming into office in 2024 and saving the day.
Well, hopefully it will be too late.
Hopefully. But anyway, do stay tuned to the Fatboy Show. I'm still going to be chatting with Wotsomu Wanda. We're going to be discussing the World Bank and how they've announced they're going to be cutting funding to Uganda. They're not extending loans. Why? Because we passed the anti-homosexuality bill. That and more great music coming your way. Keep listening to the Fatboy Show on RX Radio.